Hi, welcome back to part 2 of session 2 of Pirates, Smugglers, and the Making of the Modern World. Now, just to briefly go back of what we covered in the first half, we were looking at the reasons for the rise of these trading empires, the kinds of places that we were talking about through most of the first half. The Ottoman Empire, Spain's empire under Charles V that encompassed not only Spain but much of Central Europe and Italy. And then we looked at Portugal and the spread of its empire. And we're looking at how is this whole process going to contribute to the rise of piracy, the flourishing of piracy in the early modern world. Now, in the case of Spain and the Ottoman Empire, we saw that pretty clearly. If we look again, I'm going to use this larger map of the world. Here we've got Spain here. Here's the Ottoman Empire over here. The Ottoman Empire controls much of the trade coming through Asia, and of course we talked about the spice trade. And both Spain and the Ottoman Empire want to dominate much of the trade that occurs in the Mediterranean and that is fueled by the trade from Asia and goods coming from Europe into Asia, but particularly the goods coming out of Asia and into Europe. So each side is going to contend to control the Mediterranean. The Ottomans with their great military force, the Spanish having, at least initially, certain naval advantages. Eventually, pirates on the North African coast, the Barbarossas, are going to come to play a critical role in assisting the Ottomans and their assertion of power in the Mediterranean. So that's one example of how these two clashing trading empires will help contribute to the rise of piracy in this region. And then we finished up talking about Portugal, the small country that borders Spain, and how it explores through the 1400s and early 1500s along the coast of Africa, setting up trading posts, engaging in the slave trade, and then extends its power over here to India with a trading outpost in Goa, and sets up a series of what we call choke points at Hormuz, this central area for entering into the Middle East, the Strait of Hormuz, and Goa, where much of the trade in West India was based on spices coming from the Spice Islands, and then Malacca, which helped the Portuguese control the actual spices coming out of the Spice Islands from here in the far western Mediterranean. Now, in this case, the issue has to do more with the question of when the Portuguese established this monopoly. In fact, let's go back to that slide if I can find it for you. It really comes back to the issue of the Portuguese establishing this dominant area with their license system and these choke points. What is the response going to be by merchants and other groups already engaged in this trade, people who have been trading along the Indian coast for centuries, and the same with the spice trade in the far western Pacific? Their reaction is going to be smuggling and piracy. And if someone else comes in, a foreign power says, look, you have to do it under our monopoly now. We control the spice trade. You're not even allowed to participate. Or, even if you're not in the spice trade, you have to pay for one of these licenses if you're going to conduct trade in this region. Well, the reaction of many local groups is precisely to challenge this and do it through piracy and through smuggling. Now, let me emphasize here, because it is important, because we're going to talk about other groups in this part of the world, other Europeans coming, that whether it's the Portuguese we're talking about, in a moment I'm going to talk about the Dutch, and then we're going to talk about the English, with each of these European groups, through this early period at least, through most of the time that we're talking about them, these people are not controlling these regions in the sense that Portugal doesn't control Africa. It has some trading outposts. Its relationship with the Kingdom of the Congo, for reasons that we're not going to go into here again because it's not a course in world history per se. They have good relations with the Kingdom of the Congo. The king allows the Portuguese to establish a trading relationship there. They establish these other armed outposts, usually with the cooperation of local powers who, for one reason or another, see it to their advantage to allow the Portuguese to carry out commercial activities in their region. Same is true in India, and at least initially in the Spice Islands in that region. So it's not as if the Europeans, whether it's the Portuguese or the Dutch who follow on their heels, and even the British when they initially come, it's not as if they are dominating these regions. What they are trying to do is get a slice of the trade. And the Portuguese way of doing that is to try to dominate certain trade routes or certain types of trade, particularly the spice trade. But they are not militarily dominant in this region. The Portuguese have no intention of trying to conquer the Indian subcontinent or China, etc. That simply is not in the cards. They don't have the capacity to do that. But they do have a certain capacity to exercise control in the oceans. Certain advantages that we saw some indication of with the Spanish, and that is namely their development of naval warfare. The use of small artillery that encouraged Europeans to put artillery pieces on merchant vessels and turn them into highly effective warships. The Portuguese in particular, the idea of opening portals, holes in the size of a ship where you could put artillery pieces. You've all seen these pictures of by the 18th century, but it's certainly true in the 1500s for the Portuguese, a wooden sailing ship with holes in the side, these portholes, and cannons sticking out of them. This was a major innovation. Up until then, the major way that cannon were used on a ship is you simply put one or two in the bow or the stern. It's all right, it's just a fire alarm. This has happened before. And you then aim it at your enemy. But now, to put a series of these artillery pieces below decks and be able to fire off a large number of them and attack the enemy in this fashion was a far more effective means of naval warfare. So for the Portuguese, for a time, they have a certain advantage in this process of naval warfare that allows them to at least try to establish a complete monopoly in the spice trade. Furthermore, aside from the fact that no, they will never militarily dominate these regions, the fact is these monopolies, as we will see, were never fully effective, partly because of the piracy and smuggling that they helped initiate, and also because the Ottomans were always there challenging the Portuguese and other Europeans down through the centuries to prevent these monopolies from being totally effective. They were never totally effective, but they did help control much of the trade and limit its access. This is what we're going to be looking at when we look at piracy and smuggling in this part of the world. Okay? It comes out of this Portuguese attempt, at least, to establish a monopoly and to control through a licensing system the trade in the far western Pacific, in the Indian Ocean, in the types of areas that we were just looking at where they establish.
We're going to go to work time. I'd like to get everybody out.
Okay. We'll have to take a break, folks. Now, where are we going? Okay, so we briefly were looking at the issue of the two colliding empires in the Mediterranean, and then we talked about the Portuguese and how Portuguese efforts at creating monopolies, etc., in the Indian Ocean and in the far western Pacific will help trigger smuggling and piracy in the time after the arrival of the Portuguese. Now we want to go on and look at several other systems to pull this all together, to finish off with a few other trading empires. What were they doing? We also want to go back and take another look at the Spanish because, of course, they have other interests besides the Mediterranean. Another European power that needs to be taken into consideration are the Dutch. Now, at this time, what we now call Holland is known as the Netherlands, and it is part of Charles V's empire in Europe. However, there are problems between the Dutch and Charles and his successors. They come up because of the Protestant Reformation. You probably have some familiarity with European history. You'll know that in the beginning of the 1500s, 1517, a split emerges within the Christian church, within what was then the Catholic Church, between reformers known as Protestants and the papacy of the Pope, the centralized authority of the Christian church at that time. And Europeans divide between those who adopt Protestantism and those who continue to adhere to the papacy, to the Vatican, to the Catholic Church. The Netherlands underwent participation in the Reformation. Many people there turned to Protestantism, and of course, knowing what we do about Christian monarchs and how they feel about religious dissidents, it was inevitable that there would be a clash between the Dutch people in the Netherlands and Spain and the monarch of Spain because, of course, there is this basic difference over religion. And, of course, Spain is actually one of the major defenders, political defenders of the Catholic Church. So there will be strong differences between the two sides that will divide the Netherlands from Spain and eventually lead, as it says here on the slide, to this war of liberation that occurs between 1576 and 1609 that will eventually tear the Netherlands away from what was this vast multinational empire and establish an independent state. Now, the Dutch will become a significant force in international commerce, despite the fact that they are part of a country that is incredibly small in size. If we look back at this earlier map that I showed you of Charles's possessions and so forth, here's the Netherlands up here. Here's Amsterdam. We're talking about this part of Europe. It's very small, not heavily populated, relatively speaking, not a large society. And yet it will become extremely important in the economic history of Europe and in our history of pirates and smuggling. Why? In part because the Dutch are efficient economically. They are innovative. They are among the first to create essentially a stock market, the bourse, where you can trade shares of companies. You know, it's not Wall Street yet. It's a little early for that. We're talking about the early 17th century, but mid-16th century. I'm sorry, other developments come later. But nevertheless, this is a major advance, the development of private stock companies. Instead of individuals taking all the responsibility for an economic enterprise, the idea that you can bring on shareholders who will contribute capital and that the shares can actually be traded on a market is a major step forward in creating larger, more efficient, more powerful economic institutions. The Bank of Amsterdam, the establishment of a banking system. Again, up to this time, banking really did not exist as a separate enterprise. Merchants served as bankers, essentially. They were the ones who provided letters of credit. They were the ones who provided resources, loans, etc. in the financial world. Now a banking system is emerging in Holland long before it will in other parts of the world. Let's just call it the Netherlands, since that's the name I've been using. In any case, the Dutch are ahead of the game in establishing some of these basic institutions of a modern capitalist system, such as joint stock companies, a stock market, a banking system. All of this puts them ahead of many other countries, even in Europe at this time. In addition, I refer to the Netherlands here as the land of 10,000 ships. The Netherlands, the Dutch, proved themselves extremely efficient shipbuilders, and they develop a powerful merchant fleet. They become one of the great naval powers of the world, at least at this time, despite the fact that they are not from a very large country. They're not the kind of massive land-based system that we have with Spain or with the Ottoman Empire. Nevertheless, they are highly efficient and extremely talented naval and merchant operators. They are very effective in terms of navigation and at the building of ships. As a result, they come to play an important part in the Portuguese Empire. Now, the Portuguese have established this trading empire that goes from Portugal down the coast of Africa on to India, and then from there on to the Spice Islands, even to China. Spans thousands and thousands of miles. Portugal itself is a very small country and is impoverished in its endowment in terms of natural resources. They don't have a lot of trees. In fact, very soon after the establishment of this trading empire, many of Portugal's ships will be built in Goa, in India. Why? Because there you can find enough trees to build seagoing vessels. Still, Portugal lacked sufficient vessels and sufficient manpower to operate this far-flung empire efficiently. And often they came to employ the Dutch in terms of both men as navigators, captains, and also Dutch vessels. So the Dutch very soon make their appearance within the Portuguese trading empire, participating with the permission of the Portuguese, of course, because the Portuguese desperately need the resources that they have in terms of ships and talented men in terms of navigation and captaining naval vessels or merchant vessels. Now, as far as the Dutch were concerned, their main interest was not so much in establishing a kind of monopolistic commercial system such as the Portuguese had, but a free trade empire. They wanted to be free to move about the world and trade wherever they chose. They felt, for obvious reasons, they had significant advantages over almost any European country at this time in terms of the size and efficiency of their merchant fleet, in terms of their financial institutions, the power of these early joint stock companies. All of this gave them tremendous competitive advantages. They wanted to essentially be the world's merchant. They wanted to be the world's merchant marine. In other words, okay, what we want is to be able to sail to India, grab some goods that the Indians want to ship to the Middle East or Africa, etc., do that and make a profit out of it. We're not interested, partly because of the resources that it requires, at least initially, in establishing a monopolistic empire. However, in time, that will change, at least in regards to the far western Pacific and the Indian Ocean. In time, the Dutch will have an interest in at least gaining access to this incredibly valuable spice trade that the Portuguese have come to monopolize. In 1602, the Dutch established the Dutch East India Company. And what it was a government-sanctioned monopoly. The company is a joint stock company. In other words, it has a series of investors who each contribute money and receive shares in the company in return for that. Sounds not unlike, a more limited version of what we see today with public corporations, although the number of shareholders would be relatively small. But the Dutch East India Company is a private joint stock company, but the government gives its special powers, a monopoly essentially, to engage in trade in the Far East, thus the name Dutch East India Company. Very soon, the Dutch are going to turn on the Portuguese and begin to try to capture a portion of this trade. As much as they're interested in free trade in general, in the spice trade, they'd like a share of it. In fact, they'd like their own monopoly. One of the steps in this direction is when Dutch vessels capture the city of Amboina in 1605. Where is it? It's in the Spice Islands, okay, in the far western Pacific. This is the first aggressive step by the Dutch reaching out and seizing part of a territory where the Portuguese had been totally dominant. Then in 1619 comes the establishment of Batavia what is later known as Jakarta. And again, going to a map will show the significance of this best. Okay, we're back here with the Spice Islands. Okay, over here is Amboina. This is where they've made their first attack. Now they're establishing a center here. In fact, this bears the name of Batavia. What we're referring to is now modern-day Jakarta. Here is a central point from which they too can try to dominate the spice trade in this part of the world, and therefore the spice trade that is going to be going on and entering into the Mediterranean and European economies. So this is the plan of the Dutch as they carry it out in the early 1600s, to insert themselves by force into what is a Portuguese-dominated region, an area that, of course, they're already well familiar with because, of course, they've been serving as merchant marine members, as merchants in the service of the Portuguese commercial empire. Now they're using that knowledge to turn it upon the Portuguese and attack them. They will also establish, and this is for later reference, what's known as the Dutch West India Company, because there's another empire they would like to penetrate, the Spanish Empire in the Western Hemisphere. But here we have the Dutch now coming in and turning the tables on the Portuguese, seeking to undermine their control of the spice trade. What we have is, again, a conflict between rising trading empires, now between the Dutch and the Portuguese, battling over these goods. And here's another opportunity for piracy and smuggling. Those groups that, of course, were opposed to the domination of the Portuguese now have an ally, at least temporarily, in the Dutch, until the Dutch can create their own monopoly. So here is an opening. With these two powers fighting each other, here's an opportunity for pirates and smugglers to operate. And furthermore, there's also the question of, isn't this piracy? I mean, who attacked Amboina? Who engaged in these sieges? A private company. The Dutch East India Company did this. And who are they? They're not the, whatever you want to call it, the Royal Navy of the Netherlands or something. So isn't this a form of piracy? Again, it depends on who you're talking to and whose definition you're using of piracy. But clearly, here we have private forces acting to seize property and seize valuable goods and seize access to commercial lanes of trade. And they're operating, yes, with government approval, but they're really not part of the government. So we could define this as a form of privateering, at the very least, which in fact is a variation of, it's an officially sanctioned form of piracy. So we have both the opportunity for local pirates and smugglers, and we also have the issue of, well, gee, aren't the Dutch pirates, and weren't the Portuguese pirates before them when they came in and did this? Aren't they violating the local rules and laws of trade when they establish their monopolies and when they attack other merchants? We'll come back and obviously look at this in a little more detail. But here again, we're seeing the underlying dynamics of piracy as it will emerge in the Indian Ocean and in the Asian theater in general. Now, another and similar power emerging latest of all in Europe as a trading empire are the British. Now, the British they are the late starters of all time. Now, England encountered a similar experience to the Dutch in the sense that it too underwent a Reformation. In other words, a division within the Christian church over whether to adopt Protestant standards for the practice of Christianity or to adhere to the Pope and the Catholic Church. In the case of England, the Reformation really, although it reflected a movement from within the population, also came from the top. You're probably familiar with the story of Henry VIII and how Henry liked to get married more than once, specifically had 6 wives, and he, of course, was married in the Catholic Church to his first wife, asked for a divorce. The Pope said, gee, you can't get divorced in the Catholic Church. So Henry said, well, then I guess I'll have to create my own church. And that's how the Church of England was essentially created. So there is this certain drive from the dynasty itself to create the Protestant Church, the Church of England. And England, as with other European powers, will suffer through the turmoils of the Reformation as Christians on both sides, Protestants and Catholics, struggle over, will there be a dominant group here? Will Catholicism or will some version of Protestantism dominate England in the decades and centuries ahead? Now, even with this turmoil, however, England was proving to be a fairly prosperous economy. One of the things that helped drive its economy forward was the wool trade. Specifically, England was engaged in a massive development of sheep herding for the purpose of shearing wool and then sending wool off to Holland or to the Netherlands and other countries for processing into textiles. And this was an important development that helped drive commercial agricultural development in England at this time and helped bring prosperity to the British economy. Now, as I said, England is relatively late in the game of establishing a trading empire. A couple of reasons for this. Certainly the Reformation and the disruptions caused by that caused some delay. But more importantly, I think, is the simple fact that the powers of the monarchy were not consolidated as rapidly in England as they were elsewhere. I mean, we're talking the 1530s, and Henry and then his daughter Elizabeth are just getting around to really establishing a strong centralized monarchy. And if we look back at Spain, and it was the middle of the 1400s when Ferdinand and Isabella were getting together. And so Spain was 100 years ahead of the British in terms of consolidating and centralizing power in the monarchy. So one of the major reasons why England's a late starter is because political centralization goes at a slower pace. Now, this is reflected in explorations, and I give you just this example of Sir Francis Drake, who is one of the famous British explorers, circumnavigated the globe in 1580. Problem is, Spanish had a bit of a leap on that. Ferdinand Magellan, he finished in 1521. So the English are 60 years behind, at least, in this game of exploring. And of course, what are they looking for? They're looking for new trade routes. They're looking for access to international commerce. British aren't really seriously in the game until half a century after the Spanish. And of course, the Spanish are actually trailing the Portuguese by a bit. And of course, you look at British settlements in the Western Hemisphere, Jamestown coming in 1607. The Spanish had already been in the New World and creating settlements for 100 years by the time Jamestown is settled. So again, we're in a situation where the British are definitely far behind. Now, they'll make up for that in part because of this strong economy that I just mentioned, because of the wool trade, which helps fuel economic growth at a fairly steady pace in England at this time in the 15 and 1600s. Another factor that is important is the establishment of a fixed currency. In other words, currency with a fixed value. And, well, depending upon your knowledge of, monetary policy, this may or may not sound significant, but it's extremely significant in this period when, first of all, currency was scarce, but more importantly, currency was often of uncertain value at best. I mean, we take for granted today with the US dollar and other currencies, the German mark, etc., that, yeah, the value fluctuates and may fluctuate day to day on the international markets, etc., but you pretty much know what a dollar buys and that a dollar is a dollar, and yeah, there's some counterfeiting going on, but most people aren't affected directly by it. Back at this time, most societies didn't even have a national currency. Even many of the trading empires, through much of their early history, didn't have a clear fixed currency. What is our currency and what is its value? So the idea that England established this fairly early on really provides another solid underpinning for the development of a growing, early, modern capitalist economy, is to have a currency that has a fixed rate, because without it, it's kind of difficult to do business. And if you don't have a currency that you can use for the purchase and sale of goods, one that has a fixed value, very difficult to operate a modern economy. Another fact is that although England suffered a tremendous upheaval in the 1600s, between 1639 and 1642, what was known as the English Civil War, in which the monarch of the time was actually overthrown, and again, we're not going to get into the details of it. Despite that fact, the Civil War was actually a benefit to England economically. For one thing, it established the legality of what was known as the Enclosure Movement. And very simply, again, without getting into great detail, Enclosure meant that landlords wanted to throw peasants off the land and enclose the land to raise more sheep. Now, peasants had often worked the land for centuries, same families succeeding one another over long periods. There were bonds of loyalty on both sides between landlords and the peasants, but in parts of England at least, this was being undermined by the Enclosure Movement. One of the results of the Civil War was to legalize this and therefore accelerate the process under which agriculture was commercialized in England during this period, during the 1600s. It also establishes once and for all the idea of private property. Down through the centuries, for example, when Henry VIII carried out the Reformation in England, he took much of the church land that was controlled by monasteries and other Catholic Church institutions, and redistributed that land to members of the nobility, to landlords. Now, his argument, as was the argument of earlier monarchs, is that I gave you the land, so ultimately it's always mine, whether it's today, tomorrow, or 100 years from now. And monarchs in general have this viewpoint that land, although you're the lord of such and such and have this huge estate, yeah, it's yours for the moment, but if I don't like you, I'll throw you out and it's no longer yours. The Civil War helped establish the inviolability of private property, that if it's your property, it's yours, you can do what you want with it. So these were developments that, again, provided significant impetus to the rise of a modern capitalist economy in England and will fuel its growth as a trading empire. Another one, the creation of the Bank of England in 1694, the significance, you got a central bank. Yeah, you can have a fixed currency and you can have a stable currency because you actually have an institution which is effectively a part of the state that stabilizes the currency and helps, although in a primitive way at this time, to manage the economy. The British, like the Dutch, will establish their own East India Company. And again, like the Dutch, it's a joint stock company. Its shares are held by private investors, but it's granted a monopoly for trade in Asia. Just like the Dutch, British want to get their fingers into the same process. They want to be involved in trade in Asia. They know how valuable it is. They will not have a preoccupation with the spice trade, but they do want to enter these valuable trading regions. Now, the British go about it in several different directions in terms of establishing this trading empire. One, they become a significant force in the slave trade. Now, you remember, Portuguese come down the coast of Africa. They reach the Congo in 1481. They, among other things, are looking for slaves. That trade will grow rapidly. After 1500, millions of people will be shipped to the Western Hemisphere to work sugar plantations in the Caribbean and Brazil, eventually tobacco plantations, cotton plantations in the American South. So this trade is going to explode over the course of the 1600s and 1700s. As it's developing, the British, who, like the Dutch, have developed a fairly substantial merchant marine, insert themselves into that trade and become important carriers in the slave trade. This provides a major stimulus, again, to the economy and to their attempts to create a trading empire. In addition, the British also reach out into Asia, and specifically India is where they attempt to establish their outposts. Now again, they are in no position to conquer vast regions. What they want is the agreement of some local prince, whatever, who will allow them to establish a military outpost and a trading base in his principality, in his territory, however you want to define it. For the British, there are three areas, 3 points, which they use in India as these outposts. One is Surat, second is Madras, and the third is Calcutta. And here on the slide you see these dates, 1612, 1639, 1690. Those are the dates by which the British had established their outposts. Now, specifically, if we look at this map of the Indian subcontinent, I don't know how much we can focus. Yeah, we're doing pretty good there. Huh? I'm going to keep shifting it over. How's that? Okay, well, it's better. Okay, here's Surat up here. Okay, God, this is getting good. All right. Then the second one, Madras, is not shown on the map, but it's down here, okay, in the southeast. Okay, and then you see Calcutta here. So what they have is they have essentially a triad up here: Surat, Madagascar, Calcutta. Right, 3 key points from which they can trade. What are they looking for? Well, Madras, for example, India produces phenomenal quality textiles, the highest quality. Madras is famous for that. There is, up here in Surat, this is a major trading center for the spice trade. Remember, we mentioned Gujarat. So this is a major trading center, as is this Calcutta, a major trading center for trade with China and other parts of Asia. So they've got 3 key outposts in this sort of triangular shape on the outer perimeter of the Indian subcontinent. And there they establish themselves as traders, much like the Dutch. This is not necessarily an effort at this time to establish a monopolistic system. They really don't have the capacity to do that, but they are inserting themselves into the vibrant and valuable trades that exist in the Indian Ocean and on into other parts of Asia. And then, like the Spanish, although on a far more modest scale, they are also establishing their interests in the Western Hemisphere with their American colonies, the area that, of course, eventually becomes the 13 colonies, that eventually becomes the United States. Now, again, as we will see, this is far more modest than what the Spanish have managed to accomplish in the Western Hemisphere, but nevertheless significant. What is particularly significant for us is that with these colonies in the Western Hemisphere, they will seek to establish a closed system, a mercantilist system that will provide exclusively for trade between these colonies in the Western Hemisphere on the North American coast and England itself. So although at this time in the 1600s, when it comes to Asia, well, we're talking about the Portuguese contending with the Dutch, etc., and each trying to establish monopolies and people resisting that and taking advantage of those conflicts between the Portuguese and the Dutch to engage in piracy and smuggling. The significance of the British in our story, in terms of piracy and smuggling, will come particularly with their colonies in North America, because here they will establish a closed system. The colonies are to produce basic goods, fish, lumber, etc., the mother country to provide them with manufactured goods. And as with other monopolies, the British too are going to try to essentially squeeze the maximum profit and benefit out of this closed system. What you'll get are the kinds of shortages in the supply of goods to the New World, high prices, just the kinds of things that encourage particularly smuggling, but also piracy. So of their 2 experiences between India and the Western Hemisphere, their North American colonies, it's really the North American colonies, as we will see, where the most significant development of piracy and smuggling occurs, because that's where the British are trying to create a closed system, setting up the kinds of conditions that we see are classic for outbreaks of piracy and smuggling. But even more important than what the British will do, and a place where much of our attention is going to focus in the next few weeks, is the Spanish Empire in the Western Hemisphere. So they're the people that we want to look at in close detail for much of the rest of this session today, because when most people think of pirates in the classic form, they think of the pirates of the Spanish Main. They think of pirates operating in the Caribbean. And most of these people, through most of the period that we will talk about, were attacking the Spanish Empire in this part of the world, in the Western Hemisphere. Now, how does this come about, and why is it so significant? Why are the Spanish the target of so much of what becomes piracy in the early modern world? Well, first of all, we have to understand where the Spanish come from and what they are trying to do. We all know about Columbus in 1492. Okay? That he goes to Ferdinand and Isabella, and of course the true story of Columbus is that Columbus was either a little bit short in terms of brain power, or he was rather sly. You can take the second as the more likely idea. What he's proposing is that he will sail west and find Asia. Why should he care? For the reasons that we've already seen. Go to a map again. Here's Spain and Portugal. Here's the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire is coming to dominate the Eastern Mediterranean and the valuable trade that comes out of Asia into Europe. Portugal has already found its version of a solution. They have gone down the coast of Africa. They've gone this way. They have done a back door. Okay? They're going around this way. And they will tap into these valuable trade routes in this fashion. For Spain, Columbus offers this alternative. I'll sail west and get to the same places. Now, Columbus argues that the world is only 7,000 miles in circumference. The truth is, as ancient scientists and intellectuals well knew, the globe was approximately 25,000 miles in circumference. So Columbus obviously is either being disingenuous or isn't too bright. The fact is, he's making this argument because otherwise, if you told, Ferdinand and Isabella, well, it's going to be a 25,000-mile journey, what do you want on your mind? Nobody can sail that far. It just isn't going to happen. So it has to be a shorter distance, and he insists, I can get there, it's like musical notes, I can do it in 5 letters. I can do it in 7,000 miles. It'll only be 7,000 miles the whole round trip. So he's sailing west with the idea that he's going to find China and what is known as Japan, these areas, these sources of wealth from Asia. He's going to encounter them. He's going to avoid the Ottoman Empire, and also, of course, he's going to avoid dealing with the Portuguese who are establishing their trading outposts in Africa. So off he heads, and of course, what he runs into here are essentially, initially, the Caribbean islands. Here you can see most obviously Cuba, but also Hispaniola. And Columbus, being Columbus, tries to convince the king and queen that what he has found in Cuba is really Japan. And will insist for some time afterwards that that's what he's found, is that he's found the outer islands, of Asia, because, of course, if he doesn't insist on that, they're going to look at him and say, look, you blew it. You didn't find anything. You found a bunch of islands with people who apparently have no great wealth, to trade with us, etc. So this is all a lost cause. Well, fortunately, Columbus is able to convince them that indeed he's found at least Asia or something that looks like Asia, and on succeeding expeditions he's able to explore further. The importance of all of this is that eventually the Spanish do find great wealth in the Western Hemisphere, specifically through the efforts of these two conquistadors. One, Hernan Cortés. It is Cortés who will conquer the Aztec Empire, and Pizarro, Francisco Pizarro, who will conquer the Inca Empire. Looking at maps again, we'll come back to the slide, so if you didn't get that, we'll be back. Okay. Here's Cuba, here's Hispaniola, here's where Columbus first comes in this route. And then the Spanish begin a series of expeditions onto this mainland area. And it is here in modern-day Mexico that Cortés encounters the Aztec Empire, an empire of at least 5 to 6 million people. And an empire that possesses considerable wealth, at least by the standards of the Spanish, which is they have considerable amounts of silver and gold, which they do not use primarily for commercial purposes. It's used for ornamentation, for adorning key people in their society, etc. And again, through a series of events that we're not going to go into because this isn't a world history course, Cortés is able to conquer the Aztecs and establish Spanish control of what was their empire and a series of related Indian civilizations here in what is modern-day Mexico. Now, the other major conquest, again, is by Pizarro. Pizarro, landing on the north coast of what is today modern-day Peru, will attack the Inca Empire, which stretches from far north South America, from what is modern-day southern Colombia, all the way down the coast of South America to about the lower areas of what is modern-day Chile, this whole area, stretching 3,000 miles. This empire is conquered by Pizarro in relatively short order, and again for reasons we're not going to go into, and this becomes the other key base for the Spanish Empire in the New World. In both of these regions, in both the Andean region in the old Inca Empire and in Mexico in the old Aztec Empire, the Spanish encounter vast, valuable silver mines in addition to gold. But silver becomes the principal export from these regions. They have found the mother lode of all times in terms of metallic wealth, unseen, unheard of by anyone in human history prior to that time. This is an enormous infusion of wealth that alters the economic history of Europe and probably much of the world as a result. In the highlands of the Andes in South America, one major mine, and then in Mexico, north of modern-day Mexico City, another major mining center. And out of these two centers pours enormous wealth, as I said, just unimagined by anyone at this time or in previous centuries. The silver in particular that flows out of these two regions is so enormous in its impact that it sets off an inflationary spiral in Europe, something that hadn't even been heard or seen in contemporary times. In other words, people were not used to seeing inflation in their economies, in their societies. Now, inflation becomes a major factor in the economic history of Europe. And again, we don't have time to get into all the nitty-gritty. But the fact is, the rise of capitalism, the French Revolution, a variety of fundamental changes that occur in Europe can be in part attributed to this mass infusion of wealth. So, first of all, if we want to know why pirates and smugglers are going to have such a central role in the Spanish Empire, one clear reason is it's an area of enormous wealth. And this, again, when we're talking about precious metals, this is the ideal product for piracy and smuggling. Nothing could be better than to get your hands on metallic wealth, such as silver and gold. Has high value, relatively low volume. You can get yourself a little box of gold, a little box of silver, you've got a fortune. You don't have to be attacking someone and hauling off, 8,000 pounds of cattle hides. It's a little hard to handle, it's a little cumbersome. Here is unheard of volumes of wealth in compact form and concentrated in the hands of a single trading system, a single imperial system, and that is the Spanish system in the New World. Now, going back to our slide, and again, that'll give you time to look at the dates, for Cortez and Pizarro, see when all this begins, essentially in the early 1500s. With the conquest of these two empires and related societies, the Spanish Empire stretches eventually from what is the western United States through Mexico, down through Central America, and encompasses most but not all of South America. The largest single segment of South America is actually controlled by the Portuguese. It's Brazil. But we're concerned about the Spanish Empire. But most of the Western Hemisphere is under the control of the Spanish. An empire that encompasses, at least initially, about 25 million people. And that's an enormous number of people. And in terms of demographics, societies like Portugal has about 1 million people in it at this time. That's about the total population of Portugal. It's 1 million. Okay? And you're talking about an empire of 25 million. This is an enormous, enormous imperial system. One of the key mining centers is in South America, Potosi. That's one of the major outputs of silver. And one of the steadiest outputs of a mining operation anywhere in the world is the silver produced in Potosi in the highlands of the Andes during these centuries. Now, with the conquest complete the obvious availability of mineral wealth in both Mexico and in South America, the question becomes how to organize all of this. This is not the empire that the Spanish set out to have. What they were looking for was a trading empire linked to Asia. That's not going to happen, at least not immediately. What you do have is a vast land-based empire with enormous metallic wealth. How are you going to take advantage of that? The Spanish set up a series of institutions and practices to exploit this wealth to their maximum benefit. One is the royal fifth. All of the mineral wealth specifically is subject to taxation of 1/5 by the Spanish crown. So yes, you may be the mine owner, you may be the merchant who's explored this mine and extracted silver or possibly gold, but you have to give up 1/5 of it to the crown. So this is one major infusion of wealth for the crown, is it gets 1/5 of everything that's coming out. Now, in addition to that initial slice, the Spanish also established a system of mercantilism. It's the same type of system that I described that Britain had with its North American colonies, or would establish, because the British are obviously behind the Spanish. The Spanish are ahead in this one as well. A mercantilist system which provides for a closed trading system between the colonies in the New World and Spain itself. And this was a system that the Spanish tried to operate with very strict and rigid controls. The idea was that Spanish colonies could only trade with Spain, they could only export to Spain, and they could only import goods from Spain. So if we look again at the New World Empire in these two maps, and we're looking at the two major areas. One, here you see what's called the Viceroyalty of New Spain, what we would call Mexico and Central America. That's one of the two major administrative districts, okay, is this northern area. This is the Viceroyalty of New Spain. That's one administrative district. And then in the south, in South America, here we see the Viceroyalty of Peru, which is the second major district, which encompasses really all of this area from Venezuela down through the Andes, incorporating much of modern-day Argentina. This is the second major administrative region. You have this vast, far-flung empire, colonies all over the place, under these two principal administrative districts. All of it is to trade only with Spain, and export and import goods are only to be between these two. Now, again, as the British system later on, the idea here is the mother country wins in this system. We sell stuff at maximum price. We buy stuff from the colonies at minimum price. We control the trade. There are a select group of Spanish merchants that control the trade, okay, on both ends, both in the New World and back in Spain itself. And this is a monopolistic system. So they can dictate, well, essentially they can dictate prices in the New World in terms of what they're buying from New World colonists as well as what they're selling them. And the advantage, of course, is always going to be Spain. Spain will sell high, okay, and buy low. So in addition to the royal fifth, Spain's economy will benefit from this controlled and highly advantageous trade. Now, how do you get stuff back and forth across the Atlantic? It's a bit of a problem. It's a rather long journey. It could be dangerous. And, of course, you're going to be bringing back, although you may be sending over things like furniture and hardware and glass, etc. The fact is you're going to be bringing back silver and gold. And it has occurred to the Spanish that some people might want to attack those vessels. So they establish a fleet system. The idea is that at least once a year, sometimes twice, a fleet will sail from Spain with warships and merchant vessels, and this will bring the needed goods from Spain to the New World colonies. Then that fleet will take back silver, gold, hides, whatever else the colonies produce, to Spain. And this system is the system that will ensure control of this commerce between the New World colonies and Spain. Now, it didn't always work effectively, as we will see. Sometimes a fleet didn't sail in a given year for a variety of reasons, for a variety of problems arose. You can imagine the problems that that establishes in terms of shortages of goods and the inability to export products that you need to earn an income. Now, beyond that, to really be sure that nobody was cheating and the Spanish government wasn't going to lose anything and the Spanish merchants weren't going to lose anything, not only was it the trade to occur only through this fleet, but in addition, trade was only to take place between certain designated ports in the New World and certain ports in Spain. In Spain, at one time or another, Sevilla and Cadiz were those two. Okay? And again, we're not getting into the story of each of them, their competition or whatever. In the New World, there were also only two ports, Veracruz and Portobello. Now, we'll show you where those are. Here is Veracruz, again, modern-day Mexico. Here's Portobello down here in what is modern-day Panama. These are the only two places that you can ship goods out of or get imports from Spain. Now, when you think about this, we're not just talking about this part of the world. Okay? If we go back to our other map, let's say, okay, here's South America. Okay, jumping around too fast with these guys. Here we go. Here's Buenos Aires, okay? Spanish colonial city in far South America. Now, logic says if you're going to ship stuff out of there to Spain, you leave from Buenos Aires and go across the Atlantic, this way to Spain. You can't do that. You got to either go across land or around the southern tip of South America and take your stuff all the way up here to Portobello. Okay? Even if you're way down here, you got to jump there. Well, obviously, the camera's not going to jump that fast. This is how concentrated. Here we have Spain's own version of choke points, although they control the area completely. But again, they're going to force all commerce through these two outlets. And here you have this fabulous wealth in terms of silver and gold, and it's all being funneled through these two outlets. We look again at the map here, and you can see this is where it all had to go. And of course, where are the fleets going to go? Through the Caribbean. No wonder there's going to be vast outbreaks of piracy and smuggling. Other European powers are going to try to prey on the Spanish. They're going to use pirates to do it. Independent pirates are going to do it. This is the treasure trove of the world, and it's all being concentrated in one small geographical region. It's all between Veracruz and Portobello, and it's all going to flow through here. So not surprisingly, we're going to spend 2 sessions talking about pirates of the Caribbean. There's huge numbers of them. They're all over the place because there is this huge source of wealth, all being funneled through 2 areas. All you have to do is get out into the water and wait for one of these Spanish ships to go by, attack it. Chances are good you're going to come up with a huge amount of wealth. So that explains why Spain and the Spanish Main will be such a focus for us in the weeks ahead because, as the bank robber said, why do you rob banks? Because that's where the money is. Why do pirates proliferate in the Spanish Main? Because that's where the money is. And, of course, you've got a system designed to encourage smuggling by being so closed and so restrictive. Now, one last empire that we need to look at, and it falls in a different category, is in China. China has a long history of centralized rule. China, like the Ottoman Empire, but long before the Ottomans, established a system of scholar gentry called mandarins, trained bureaucrats, that help control a vast and centralized empire. As we've seen, China became, in a sense, one of these warrior states, although I'm not sure this term quite applies, but it too was subject to a nomadic invasion of the Mongols, and we see the rise of the Mongols and Genghis Khan and Kublai Khan. The Mongols being succeeded by a new Chinese dynasty, the Ming. And it's that period that was one of the most effervescent in China's history, where China was trading with many of the same regions we've just talked about the Europeans being in. Southeast Asia, Indonesia, the Indian Ocean. A Chinese admiral, Zheng He, explored these regions in the 1420s and the 1430s. So China has many of the attributes of one of these expanding trading empires by this period. But China's story, when we come to talk about pirates, is not going to be of a dominant trading empire that's challenged by pirates. Because if this was the effervescent point in Chinese history in this period, in early modern times, it was also the beginning of decline. As China would enter into a period of isolation, China would face serious problems with a lack of innovation in technology. It would face the problems of an exploding population that would be difficult to feed in the centuries ahead. So with all these other empires, the Ottomans, we're talking about the Portuguese, the Spanish, the Dutch, the English, with each of them we're looking at this dynamic expanding power and how in trying to create monopolies and trading empires, they encourage piracy and smuggling. At least the case we're going to look at with China is going to be a story of an empire that's in decline. And that decline is what is going to encourage piracy. The inability to control pirates, the lack of political power and military force to do so. So China's story is almost diametrically opposed, at least in the case we're using, from those of these other empires. So how do we sum it all up? What we've been looking at today is the link between the rise of trading empires and how those conditions give rise to piracy and smuggling. Specifically, three main factors enter in here. Three scenarios, I think it's probably better to describe them as. One, the issue of imperial clashes and pirates. And we've set up one of the main cases, Spain and the Ottomans in the Mediterranean. We'll see a similar example, Spain and England, one example, in the Caribbean. Other powers would challenge Spain as well. But in both cases, you've got trading empires trying to dominate a region and clashing with each other. And in both cases, we talk about the Ottomans in Spain, we talk about Spain and England and the Spanish Main, we will see it behooves the powers that be, these powers in conflict, to turn to pirates to aid them in their conflict and aid them in their attempts to establish themselves as dominant trading powers. And we will also see the attempt to control trade and monopolize it, as most of these trading empires do in one place or another, is a tremendous incentive to smuggling. When you create monopolies, you encourage smuggling. Portugal, Spain will do this. Portugal, with its license system, its attempt to dominate the spice trade, will encourage local groups who have been excluded from this, who practiced this trade in the past, to turn to smuggling and piracy. So too, the Spanish, as they try to dominate and monopolize trade in the New World, will encourage piracy and smuggling. And then the last example, the one we were just talking about, in opposition to these other cases of rising trading empires and how they encourage piracy and smuggling, or how they actually aid and support it to their benefit when they come into conflict with each other, in direct opposition to those is China. China, an empire after its florescence, its engagement in trading empire activities, begins to enter a period of severe decline. And by the time we look at China in the late 18th, early 19th century, this declining empire is unable to control piracy. So this sets the stage for the sessions to come, the rise of early modern piracy. We see why that happened because of the rise of these trading empires. And we'll be looking at the detailed facts, first of the Ottoman-Spanish clash next week, and then in succeeding weeks, the pirates of the Spanish Main, and then Chinese pirates. But here are the roots. This is what we've examined today. Thank you.